Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, wanted to share my thoughts on the passing of former Ohio State head football coach Earle Bruce. So it's a sad day anytime someone passes away. We're all touched by the deaths of loved ones, family members, people that we respect, and people that we cherish and honor. I'm not going to delve into Earle Bruce's personal life. It's apparent from the comments made by former assistants and former players and the people that knew him that he was a fine, outstanding man as a family man, as a husband, as a parent, and as a football coach. I'm going to review the career of Earle Bruce at Ohio State. He, of course, took over the Buckeyes program in 1979 under somewhat trying conditions. Not that the program was in bad shape in terms of talent and resources. It was Ohio State as we know it, but coming off the Gator Bowl incident in which Woody Hayes punched Charlie Ballman. And if you're not familiar with that incident, you need to become familiar. It's a place in college football history that's not necessarily something to be honored or to be vilified either. Woody Hayes was being Woody Hayes, and he was near the end of his career anyway. And at the end of a Gator Bowl loss against Clemson, in which Ohio State was driving for the potential game-winning points, Art Schlechter picked off by Charlie Ballman. He ran to the sideline, and the game was over. There was 30 or 40 seconds left in the game, so Clemson just had to run out the clock. So there was a mass of tacklers and players and coaches around the sideline, and Woody Hayes punched Charlie Ballman, and that led to Woody Hayes' dismissal after 28 seasons. And we know that he is a legend, and if you're not familiar with Woody Hayes, that's something else to look up. One of the legendary coaches in the history of college football. Earle Bruce unable to live up to that legend. Few would have, if anyone, at that point. But Earle Bruce took over a team that was not expected to do much in 1979. They were preseason unranked, an Ohio State team, preseason unranked, coming through the 70s, in which were, in many respects, the glory years for Woody Hayes, albeit not culminating with national championships. 4 consecutive Rose Bowls, always finishing in the top 5 to 10 in the country, winning Big Ten championships. Earle Bruce won his first 11 games at Ohio State with a team full of sophomores that would later play in the NFL. A very talented team that took an extremely loaded, talented USC team to the brink at the Rose Bowl. Ohio State coming in number 1, USC number 3, probably the 2 best teams in the country. Although the USC narrow win sent the national championship to Alabama, who beat a decent Arkansas team in the Sugar Bowl. So Earle Bruce finishes 11-1, gets a huge win against Michigan after Ohio State had lost 3 consecutive games against Michigan, in which the Buckeyes did not score a touchdown in 1976, 7, and 78. They win in Ann Arbor, go to the Rose Bowl, Big Ten champs, 11-0. Lose the national title game when Charles White just ran roughshod down the field in the final 2 or 3 minutes and scored the game-winning touchdown 17-16. So Ohio State was primed for a huge 1980. They started the season ranked number 1. They stumbled against Syracuse, not in terms of a loss, but they looked bad, so they dropped in the polls. A couple weeks later, they lost to UCLA 17-0, and the season never lived up to the hype. And Ohio State finished 9-3. With a loss to Michigan and a loss to Penn State in the Fiesta Bowl. Penn State not in the Big Ten at the time. And so the Buckeyes finished 9-3 in the top 15 in the country. The 1981 season was a bit of an odd season for Ohio State football. Coming off number 1 preseason ranking the year before, not much expected in 81. They lost 3 games pretty early in the season. They lost to Wisconsin, who they hadn't lost to since 1959. They lost to Florida State, who was not yet Florida State, although they had been to the Orange Bowl 2 consecutive years. They lost to Minnesota, and Ohio State had one of the very worst pass defenses in the country. Still, they rallied down the stretch, and they played Michigan in Ann Arbor and pulled off a double-digit upset, 14-9. Art Schlechter sliding into the snowbank in the corner of the end zone after scoring the game-winning touchdown, and the Buckeyes won 14-9 to share the Big Ten championship. They went on to the Liberty Bowl as Big Ten champs. They were slotted down to the Liberty Bowl where they beat Navy 31-28 in a close game, but they avoided embarrassment and the upset to finish 9-3 and number 12 in the country. The 1982 team started 2-3. They lost 3 consecutive games after winning the first 2, and one of those losses was to John Elway and Stanford in Columbus, and Stanford wasn't very good. The Buckeyes beat them the year before in Palo Alto, but we got a glimpse of John Elway early on, and then he came back to Columbus and pulled off a 2-minute drive late, and this was a harbinger of things to come for Mr. Elway, and he knocked off the Buckeyes, and Ohio State lost to Stanford, Florida State, and Wisconsin again, 6-0 shutout for the first time in decades at Ohio Stadium, and the Buckeyes were 2-3. But they rallied with 7 consecutive wins in 1982 to finish 9-3. And they beat Michigan again, which, in an oddity, they played a different number of conference games in 1982. They finished 7-1, Michigan 8-1. Therefore, Michigan got to go to the Rose Bowl, even though they lost the head-to-head to the Buckeyes, and Ohio State was relegated to the Holiday Bowl, and they ripped up BYU and won Steve Young 47-17. 1983, really good Buckeyes team. Keith Byers at running back. Ran for a ton of yardage, 20-some touchdowns. Mike Tomczak at quarterback. And really, Earle Bruce's legacy at Ohio State should include the passing game. Because, of course, Woody Hayes didn't run it, and the Buckeyes were anemic on the ground. He did draft or recruit a quarterback, Woody Hayes did, in Art Schlechter, who would turn out to be a top 5 pick for the NFL draft. But Art Schleicher's freshman year, 4 touchdowns, 21 interceptions, partially because he was a freshman, partially because the passing game was not sophisticated at all, and that was Woody Hayes' fault. Earle Bruce opened up the offense, especially for that time, and Ohio State flourished in the passing game for the first time in its history. So Mike Tomczak, Keith Byers, and John Franks, a tight end, who later won Super Bowls with the San Francisco 49ers, and a really good defense. Beat Oklahoma, who was number 1 in the country early in the season, 24-14. But they lost 3 close Big Ten games. On the road, Illinois, good team that went to the Rose Bowl under Jack Trudeau. Chuck Long in Iowa, they lost that game, and they lost to Michigan in Ann Arbor in 1983. So the Buckeyes finished 9-3 after winning the Fiesta Bowl on a Thad Jemison touchdown with about 35 seconds left in the game on a bomb from Mike Tomczak, and the Buckeyes finished 9-3 to salvage the season and finished in the top 10 in the country. They finished very high. They were well regarded despite the 3 losses and finished 7th or 8th in the country. 1984, Buckeyes win the Big Ten. They did stumble against Purdue and Jim Everett and stumbled against Wisconsin again. Wisconsin has had a couple stretches against Ohio State football in the last 30 years, and one would be that stretch in the early 80s against Ohio State in which they tripped up the Buckeyes 3 times as huge underdogs. This was not the Wisconsin of today. This was a floundering Wisconsin program, but they beat Ohio State at home 16-14. And the Buckeyes finished 9-2. They beat Michigan resoundingly at the Shoe, 28-6. Keith Byers scored a couple touchdowns. And this team with Chris Carter, Chris Spielman, both were freshmen. Electric type team. Pepper Johnson on defense as well. A really good secondary with the likes of William White. And the Buckeyes go 9-2. They go to the Rose Bowl as a favorite, and they lose to USC. Chris Carter had a record-breaking Rose Bowl with over 200 yards of receiving. Keith Byers had a long run early in the game of 50 yards, but Ohio State lost to USC as they did normally in those days in the 70s and 80s, and that was the last of the Rose Bowl losses to USC in the 1984 season, January 85. 1986, the Buckeyes get off to an awful start. They lose the Kickoff Classic. Remember the Kickoff Classics? I remember so many involving Nebraska and Miami and Auburn and a bunch of other teams. This was an Alabama-Ohio State kickoff classic, and it was a hard-fought game, and it went down to the end. And Ohio State had the football inside the Alabama red zone, but they lost 16-10, and then lost the next weekend. A team as talented as Ohio State in 1986 went out to Washington and got just bludgeoned by the Huskies 40-7. Then they suddenly rebounded, won 9 consecutive games, looked the part, top 10 team, and then lost a classic against Michigan at the Shoe 26-24. Had an early lead. The offense was working. Carsados and Chris Carter. Chris Spielman had an just unfathomable number of tackles, I believe 29 in that game. But Michigan came back and won at 26-24 when Matt Franz missed a 45-yard field goal at the gun, and the Buckeyes lost 26-24. That denied Ohio State of the outright Big Ten championship. They still shared it with Michigan, and it cost them the Rose Bowl. And so Earle Bruce had another 9-3 season. So count them up: 1981, 2, 3, 4, and 5, all 9-3 seasons. 1986, 9-3 as well, until they won the Cotton Bowl. So they finished 10-3 because they played an extra game. And that was a big game against Texas A&M and Jackie Sherrill. And Ohio State's defense dominated 28-12. So that was the Earle Bruce game in which he got sick and tired of hearing about Jackie Sherrill and how good he looked and how much more polished he was than Earle Bruce, which after covering Jackie Sherrill myself for 6 years, up close and personal, found that to be quite amusing later. But Jackie Sherrill was extremely good to me, and that's another story. But in regards to Earle Bruce, he wanted to kind of shed the just got the ball cap on, and I'm just kind of a average Joe kind of football coach, and I really don't belong here at Ohio State. And he donned the fedora a la Tom Landry and the suit and tie for the 1987 Cotton Bowl, and the team didn't even know he was going to do this. He had his regular coaching gear on in the locker room at the Cotton Bowl. Then the players took the field, and before they did, he came out with the suit on, and the Buckeyes went out there and they ripped up Texas A&M 28-12. And that for the final game in 1986, and for what turned out to be Earle Bruce's final season in 87, unexpectedly to anyone, coming off Ohio State's football seemed to be in great shape. They finished number 7 in the country that year in 86, but Earle Bruce donned the suit and tie and the fedora the rest of his coaching career there at Ohio State for that final season in 87. But the Buckeyes tied LSU, really good game. Defensive struggle at LSU, blocked a field goal actually to preserve the tie, but then they went on a bizarre string of late game collapses against decent marginal teams. They lost the 4 games. They were 5-4-1. Earle Bruce was fired the week of the Michigan game. The band showed up at his house to honor him, but he was fired before the Michigan game because the Buckeyes, who were preseason top 5-4-1 record going into the big game against Michigan. And Earle Bruce, lame duck coach. Ohio State played for him. They won 23-20 in Ann Arbor, sent him off a victor in his final game at Ohio State. So for Earle Bruce, no, he didn't have a legendary career at Ohio State, but very respectable in winning 76% of his games over 9 seasons, 81-26-1, had the best record in the Big Ten over those 9 seasons, 57-17, won the Big Ten 4 times, went 5-4 against Michigan, went 5-3 in bowl games. Let's give it up for Earle Bruce. Again, I understand he was a tremendous man, just a solid family guy, a solid person, a solid man of character. I just wanted to review my thoughts about his coaching career at Ohio State. Of course, he then went on to coach at Colorado State and Northern Iowa, or he had been at Colorado State, got the Ohio State job off of the Iowa State coaching stint as a head coach, and was on Woody Hayes' staff back in the 1960s, early 70s, before he went and coached Tampa. And actually, John Matuzak, and a pro wrestler as well, if you remember John Matuzak of the Oakland Raiders, that gruff bunch that played with John Madden in the 1970s. So just my thoughts about Earle Bruce. Just wanted to throw that out there on his passing at the age of 87. Our best to his family, his friends, and those people surrounding the Bruce family in this time of mourning.